Good morning. I am here on the beautiful island of Maui, the second largest island in Hawaii. It is my absolute favorite place to visit, and it is really not hard to see why. It is an island filled with beautiful, pristine coastline and lush tropical rainforest. And, as of recently, scars of a catastrophic tragedy.
The governor has been warning that the death toll will go up. The scale of the devastating loss now unprecedented in modern times.
The deadliest wildfire in the U.S. in more than 100 years, claiming at least 93 lives.
These fires ravaged the island community, killing over 100, displacing thousands, and torching everything in its path. Tragedies like these shed light on how places like Maui are susceptible to exacerbated effects of natural disasters. A very isolated place with limited resources. In the immediate aftermath of the fires, the Hawaii Tourism Authority urged that any non-essential travel to the island be avoided as to not further strain these resources. Hawaiian native Jason Momoa publicly echoed these sentiments, passionately pleading tourists to not visit the island. But as the recovery efforts continued, the tone of the authorities on the ground suddenly changed.
Governor Josh Green made a plea to visitors to return to Maui.
Just 2 weeks later, the governor urged people to come back to the island, albeit to the areas that were not directly affected by any wildfire damage.
I want to speak to the world when I say this. All of the other areas of Maui, friends, and the rest of Hawaii are safe. They're open. When you come, you will support our local economy and help speed the recovery of the people that are suffering right now.
This understandably caused a lot of mixed reactions. On one hand, you had one camp urging people to stay away as to not divert precious resources and give people on the ground more time to heal. But at the same time, you had another camp urging people to come back to prevent the island from spiraling into an economic collapse.
After all, tourism makes up about a quarter of the state's overall GDP and nearly 40% of Maui County's GDP. In the weeks following the fire, visitor numbers plunged nearly 75% as tourists responded to the devastation and early calls to stay away. And this dip estimated to have cost the island about $13 million per day in visitor spending, a number so clearly unsustainable given how much the island depends on that income.
So, which camp is right? Or better yet, can both of these messages coexist? Maui is just one example of many around the world where popular destinations are grappling with how to handle unsustainable levels of tourism, an industry that, for many of these places, is the kingpin of the local economy. Not just from a dollars and cents perspective, but one that concerns the jobs and livelihoods of so many people. An industry whose very existence hinges on its ability to sustain and protect its coveted destinations before it's too late.
We live in a world today that is more accessible than it's ever been. What used to be reserved for only the affluent, leisure traveling has never been more affordable than it is today. Adjusted for inflation, the average domestic airfare here in the US has dropped 36% since 1995. Low-cost airlines all around the world have introduced lower prices into the market, and points and miles enthusiasts are consistently finding ways to subsidize their travel while minimizing out-of-pocket expenses. On top of that, we're now more connected than we've ever been. This era of social media and the internet means the consistent, non-stop showcasing of beautiful destinations all around the planet. What Rick Steves once pioneered can now be found everywhere, for free, on demand with the tap of a finger, with stunning visuals to boot. All of these factors have resulted in tourism becoming an absolute powerhouse of an economic industry. Before the onset of the COVID pandemic, the total number of international arrivals seen around the globe eclipsed the 1 billion mark way back in 2011, increasing at an average rate of 5% per year before hitting its peak of nearly 1.5 billion people in 2019. Likewise, the total number of tourism receipts experienced a similar growth trajectory, capping at nearly $1.5 trillion in 2019, helping make tourism the third largest industry in the entire world when measured in export earnings. These numbers naturally took a drastic dip at the onset of the pandemic, but they have rapidly been recovering in the 5 years since. By the end of 2024, tourism arrivals once again surpassed the 1.4 billion mark, a 359% increase from 2020 and matching their pre-pandemic levels. But it's important to understand that these numbers aren't necessarily dispersed equally across the globe. As we all know, there are destinations that are clearly more popular with visitors than others. A whopping 52% of all international tourist arrivals in 2024 were in Europe alone, with 6 of the top 10 countries in the world for inbound tourism being European nations. Here in Italy, they saw nearly 58 million tourist arrivals in 2024, making them the 5th most popular country to visit and accounting for 4% of the entire world's inbound tourism. Which is pretty insane to wrap your head around, considering the fact that the country only has a population of 60 million people and a total land area that ranks it a mere 73rd in the entire world. The sheer size of this industry provides a lot of economic benefits, specifically for these areas that experience the most inbound tourism. The ever-increasing jobs and employment numbers are one such benefit of this massive industry. This can be seen in direct terms, with jobs in areas like shopping, dining, hospitality, commercial aviation, but also in indirect terms, with jobs like the manufacturing of the aircraft or the construction of the hotel properties. By the end of 2024, nearly 357 million people worldwide were employed either directly or indirectly by the travel and tourism industries. And by the end of 2025, it's estimated that that number could increase exponentially to nearly 450 million people. To put these numbers into perspective, that is nearly 10% of the entire world's employee pool that is dependent on a strong and thriving tourism sector to survive. A byproduct of the growth of this industry can be seen in the form of investments and improvements to local infrastructure that are needed in order to sustain the demands that come with this amount of foot traffic. One such example of this going on right now is the O'Hare 21 project taking place right in my backyard here in Chicago. This project includes a massive expansion of terminals and concourses, among other things, and is bringing with it tens of thousands of jobs to the local community. These are the kinds of infrastructure investments that are brought about by the necessities associated with a growing traveling industry, whose benefits positively impact those that live in the area in which those investments are being made. Take it from a local, these investments will greatly improve my experience at the airport that I frequent naturally more than any other. So not only are these investments bringing with them economic and employment opportunities, but those who reside here, those who live here, will be able to reap the benefits of these investments more than anybody else. Local treasuries also stand to gain from tourism in the form of taxation, both direct and indirect. Visitors directly contribute to these treasuries by paying sales taxes on goods and services, lodging taxes on accommodation, and other tourist taxes that are becoming more popular around the world. Visitor spending can also fuel business growth, helping increase revenues and profits for these businesses, and thus higher nominal income tax amounts realized by local governments. Positive benefits of tourism can go well beyond those that are just purely economic. One of the consequences of people wanting to go out and experience a certain culture is the preservation of said culture. External interest in local food, art, music, and history provides not only the incentive to maintain it, but to actively promote it and share it and celebrate it. And of course, cross-cultural understanding and a heightened sense of global awareness that permeates from interactions between visitors and locals can be seen in a positive light as well. Now, I know these things aren't necessarily quantifiable, but I could certainly speak from my own personal experiences and vouch for the fact that these cross-cultural interactions have not only helped me shape my worldview, but have also taught me things that I would have never otherwise learned within the confines of my local community. This goes for the interactions that I've had with locals while I've been traveling, but also my interactions with visitors who have come here to experience my home. But what are equally as relevant and oftentimes more dominating in the tourism discourse today are all of the negative effects that come with this continuously expanding industry. And unfortunately, that list is a lot longer than we realize. First and foremost, there are the things that we can see happening firsthand. It isn't very hard to spot serious overcrowding throughout some of the world's most popular destinations, whether that be in major cities, at the foot of cultural landmarks, or at extremely crowded beachfront resorts. Not only can these crowds impede local ways of life, but too much foot traffic can cause accelerated erosion of landmarks and excess strain on local infrastructure and resources. And then there is the ever-increasing commodification of culture, essentially using the allure of a destination for profit or monetary gain. And while this can be seen in a positive light when it concerns local craftsmen and businesses realizing this income, the reality is that it also leads to an increased commercialization of these places. I mean, walking through the streets of old European cities and seeing McDonald's and Starbucks everywhere, that just feels weird. And it's this phenomenon that can be seen as a serious degradation of the culture and the authenticity of these places. But these issues are just the tip of the iceberg. In 2019, during the peak of pre-pandemic travel, the Travel Foundation, along with Cornell University, published this report on what they dubbed tourism's invisible burden, essentially the hidden costs of tourism that go well beyond the problems that we've already identified. An extremely prominent issue highlighted throughout this report is the strain that tourism puts on local resources, oftentimes exacerbated by the lack of infrastructure needed to support excess demand. Water is one such resource that experiences this. And not only are we talking about visitors consuming water to shower or to drink, but also the massive amounts of water required for things like pools or irrigation systems needed to make parks and gardens look perfect for visitors. This liberal use of water by the tourism industry has led to a growing number of cases where access to fresh and uncontaminated water is shrinking. Take, for example, the island paradise of Bali in Indonesia, where over-extracting of fresh water has led to salt contamination in the groundwater, making it unsuitable for human consumption. Unsurprisingly, this is primarily being seen in the areas that have a high density of lodging accommodations. Heavy demands on local water resources leave destinations at a high risk of literally running out of water, especially during the dry seasons. At least 12 locations across 6 countries were designated in 2018 as having high or extremely high overall water risk scores. Not only is the rapid consumption of scarce resources cause for concern, but also is the management of tourism's biggest byproduct: waste. In the ever-popular island nation of the Maldives, official statistics show that the average tourist generates about 3.5 kilograms of garbage per day, more than twice the average of someone living in the capital of Male, and 5 times that of those living anywhere else on the archipelago. All in all, the tiny country produces nearly 860 metric tons of waste every day, the majority of which gets transferred to the island of Thilafushi, an island that was intentionally man-made entirely out of garbage. Yes, you heard that right. Back in 1991, the government approved of the project to reclaim the island to solve the nation's trash problem, and it was done by digging massive pits on the ground, filling them with garbage, and layering sand on top. And now you've reclaimed land, and you have a new magical island that is literally made up of garbage. Today, it's estimated that over 330 tons of trash are transported to the island every day to meet the same fate, which is so much garbage that the reclaimed land is growing at a rate of 1 square meter every day. Concerns have been raised about the contents of the garbage that is being buried, with environmentalists saying that items like used batteries and asbestos are sources of toxic heavy metals that could seep into the water and pose some serious health and ecological issues. The excess trash that isn't able to be buried ends up being incinerated out in the open, creating toxic smokes and carbon emissions that also pose some serious health risks. These hidden costs may also arise as a result of something that we may have initially viewed as a positive. Remember earlier how we were discussing how local destinations benefit from the revenues that tourism brings in? Well, that assertion naturally comes with the presumption that those revenues will eventually be allocated appropriately. And unfortunately, that's not always the case. Oftentimes, targeted tourism tax revenues, such as lodging taxes and passenger arrival fees, that are realized at the local level end up getting funneled to state and national tourism authorities whose primary objectives are to promote and increase tourism. Thus, a lot of those revenues end up funding the marketing for additional tourism, ironically leaving the destinations at the local level highly dependent on additional funding from the national government or debt financing to handle the increasing costs associated with this tourism influx. Take, for example, Cancun, whose taxation system has traditionally allocated 80% of international passenger fees to promoting travel at the federal level, while vital infrastructure in the area has lagged behind. Mexican researchers documented in 2013 that only about 30% of wastewater produced in the region was treated, 95% of which could be attributed to tourist activities. And of course, there are plenty of additional environmental strains that excess tourism puts on these destinations. While it is difficult to calculate precise numbers, it is estimated that the travel and tourism industry accounted for about 6.5% of all emissions globally in 2023. Residual effects of climate change have been well documented for decades now, not least of which being sea level rise and subsequent coastal erosions, again putting the island destinations that rely so heavily on tourism economically at the greatest risk.
Now, while all of this may seem very doom and gloom, the good thing is these things aren't going unnoticed, and there are steps being taken today to mitigate these negative effects and usher in a new age of tourism. From initiatives like major world airlines committing to expanded use of sustainable aviation fuel, or Alaska Airlines becoming the first US airline to totally ban plastic cups on board, the big players are finally starting to come to the table to do their part. Progress is being made at the local level too. The government of the Maldives, for example, recently passed a total ban on the import and consumption of single-use plastics aimed at tackling their ever-growing garbage problem, as we discussed earlier. And here in Hawaii specifically, a lot of reckoning has been done to evaluate how the future of tourism will look like on the islands. The concept of regenerative tourism is also becoming a popular solution here, where visitors are encouraged to give back their time physically to the islands through various volunteering activities. The University of Hawaii recently carried out a survey on this subject with Kauai residents, where 95% of them responded favorably to the idea of regenerative tourism, and a whopping 99% said that it would give them a more favorable view of tourists overall. And of course, the ongoing fire recovery efforts here on Maui present a unique opportunity to ensure that the post-wildfire coastal infrastructure is built with climate resilience in mind. Locating new buildings further away from the shore can help mitigate coastal erosions by reducing foot traffic, and being intentional with using resilient building materials can better prepare for things like sea level rise or other extreme natural weather events that may happen in the future. Now, the discussion of these large-scale problems and solutions is great, and it's very productive, and it's very necessary. However, making this the sole focus of the conversation is dangerous in that it can easily allow for the deflection of our responsibility as individuals. Yes, it is true that tourism at a large and excessive scale is what causes these problems in the first place. But what burden can or should be placed on the individual tourist? After all, the industry as a whole is the sum of its parts, and the most integral piece to this puzzle is the individuals that are actually the ones that are putting it together. Well, as we've explored, the visiting tourist doesn't have control over things like lack of waste management systems or misallocation of tax revenues. So while a lot of the anti-tourism sentiment is directed at the individual tourist, it is clear that the large-scale change will have to come from these governments and agencies enacting sustainable policies that we as the tourists would be subjected to. But still, regardless of that fact, just don't go and these problems won't persist. It is a pretty straightforward line of thinking. Well, that paradoxically isn't a sustainable solution either, because for better or for worse, a lot of the places that are most susceptible to the impacts of over-tourism are the same places that are so dependent on the tourist dollar to survive economically. So in a way, it almost feels as if we're stuck accepting the bad that comes with the good.
That being said, knowing that they will be contributing to these issues, is the individual tourist inherently a bad person for wanting to travel or wanting to see the world or wanting to explore these places? No, I don't think it's fair to paint that broad of a stroke across all of those people who love to travel. But does the visiting tourist have individual decisions that they have to make while on the ground to determine how their personal visit will impact the destination? Absolutely. It is and should always be the individual's responsibility to leave a place better than how they found it. Things like shopping local and supporting small businesses, not leaving trash around and being environmentally conscious, or simply just being aware and sensitive to local customs and cultures and norms and ways of life. And sure, these individual impacts on a short 3-day weekend trip may just be a drop in the bucket, or a drop in the ocean, to be honest. But if all of us as a tourist community can work on scaling these practices together, it would surely usher in positive impacts on the destinations that we're visiting and allow all of us, locals and tourists alike, to realize the positive benefits of tourism if practiced responsibly.
I absolutely love coming to this island. It is easily my favorite place that I've ever been. But every time I come back, I ponder if I, as a non-native Hawaiian, am allowed to feel this way about a place that isn't mine. I'm not really sure there's an answer to that.
While I may not have any cultural ties to this place or to its people, the one thing that we do have in common is that we're all humans who, against all conceivable scientific odds, exist together on a floating rock in the middle of space. An unbelievably beautiful floating rock. We're all humans who share this planet called Earth, whose grandeur and beauty should be celebrated and experienced as our collective home. But that doesn't absolve us from recognizing that loving a place that isn't yours comes with a great responsibility. A responsibility to understand that there is a very fine line between loving a place and loving a place to death. Thanks for watching.